Alazan Apache courts were a really important factor of the West Side. It's really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, when we talk about demolishing any public housing, it's going to be a loss of deeply affordable housing. That's going to be a really big impact on the community, and that's always going to be a problem. But with Alazan Apache specifically, the courts were one of the oldest housing units in the city, and also one of the largest. They still are. There's over 500 families who live there. And so when there's talks of demolition, we knew that not only were we losing this deeply affordable source of housing in a housing stock situation that's already needing more housing, but displacement is also dispersing the families.
We're a very tight-knit community, and there's a lot of history here and culture, and we want to keep that intact. And we'd like to keep the historical aspect of the buildings intact while still providing modern-day conveniences for the tenants. So that would entail renovating the inside of the buildings. We'd like to bring them back up to the standards that they were when they originally built.
We want more community. So as Kayla was saying, we want to keep the community, but actually we want it to go back further. When I was younger, there were teams, basketball teams and softball teams, and more experiences with the residents and just neighbors. So that's what we envision for the future of Alazan.
So one of the big things that the San Antonio Housing Authority and a few other government entities had pitched around the demolition conversation had been this idea that the courts were too old, that there is no point in repairing. Yes, there is historical value in an old building, but there was no need to repair what was so far gone.
It goes back to when we were starting to get calls from residents at the Alazan who were getting notices to vacate based on some fees that the residents really were not responsible for. That led to fees being encroaching on rent payment. So then all of a sudden a resident was not up to date on rent. And we made flyers and went around talking to people, because we realized when we talked to this first resident, he said, this is happening to my neighbor, and the person over there is getting the same thing. So we just went around and gave information to as many residents as we could. So then our phone started ringing, and Kayla reached out to me.
The campaign around Alazan was really one that was deeply rooted in what had historically been happening there, which is neighbors looking out for each other, and residents who lived in the area surrounding the public housing just as integrated in what's happening with the public housing as those who are living there.
We suspected that why is Saha doing this? And we suspected because we had heard that they wanted to demolish some of the buildings, but it hadn't been vocalized by Saha. So sure enough, after going through the issue with the Alazan lofts that they were building across from the Casa de Cuentos, we found through meetings with Saha that they were planning to demolish.
The first experience that's really important that the tenants were going through at this time is we had a new property manager. And this property manager was horrible to us. They were giving us lease violation after lease violation that didn't even apply to us. And we were just getting stacks of them every week. And staff was extremely disrespectful. They were yelling at us. They were talking down to us, treating us like inmates in a prison. And this is all happening as soon as the new manager starts. So I had been served my eviction notice for the same thing, fees that were assessed to my account that were wrong. And I had actually gone through the grievance process. A lot of people don't know about it, they don't understand it, but I read my lease and I went through the grievance process and won. So the fact that this was on my account was just insane. At the Housing Commission meeting, where they announced they're moving forward with this project of demolishing, and they're partnering with NRP and all of that, the pandemic hit. the pandemic hit. That was huge for everyone, that all across the country. And then they started doing, virtual meetings, and they were able to shut us up. They were able to cut us off. They were able to mute us. All of a sudden, me, I'm pretty computer savvy. I'm able to connect. I use Zoom all the time. But all of a sudden, my Zoom doesn't work. It doesn't allow me to get in.
She can't get unmuted.
Yeah, I can't unmute. So I call on the phone, and my phone doesn't unmute, but the other people's phones unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were constantly trying to have this conversation with them, but because of the pandemic, we could not meet face to face. We couldn't meet in person. We had to do it their way, and then they were blocking us. A lot of our folks don't have internet access, and they're not technologically inclined, so it was harder to reach our people out here. And then at the same time, we were reaching people we were never reaching before, because on Zoom meetings and on these media platforms, we were able to reach people all across the country going through the same thing. So we were having much larger conversations and getting new and inventive ideas from all over the country.
And when we started building the campaign, the demolition was the clear threat. So the goal was really clear. It was quite easy. We started having neighborhood meetings. We did a couple of door knocking sessions. For this campaign, it wasn't really an issue of convincing others of the importance of the issue, because everybody knew that a demolition in this neighborhood was just going to clear way for higher income, newer construction that was going to really disrupt the neighborhood character. And so because of that, the campaign was just about getting the word out. The motion was there, the desire to maintain the units was there, and we had that ability to have numbers and build public pressure.
So we were making these public comments. They were muting me, keeping me from going. But we had all of these new people to jump on these calls and make the comments, so the comments were still coming through. They didn't want the rest of the world to know that the community did not want this to happen.
But behind the scenes, we've also gotten more allies. So Housers, TOP, other organizations have joined in.
We had planned to make this protest happen. This protest all about keeping people housed, making sure these public housing units don't come down. And we had planned to have this happen, and we realized in the weeks leading up to it, we needed to build up the public pressure. So we started having public housing tenants, allies, neighborhood leaders, everyone we could find show up to public comment at the San Antonio Housing Authority Board of Commissioners meeting. The first couple times we did so, we gave our public comment. They said thank you, and we stayed for the meeting, but nothing really happened. But I remember the second to last, or maybe the last meeting before this protest, we were there with our full force of numbers. I think there was about 72 of us ready for public comment, and press came up to us before and after to get our side of the story. And that was a huge turning point for us, because thus far the media, which was totally dictating the public narrative around this, had been on the side of the housing authority and the benefits of demolition and how important it was going to be to make sure these units came down.
And we did go before the former CEO's apartment, because he lived down the street from Saha. Mm-hmm. So we did a little march, and then at that point they got really upset, and how dare you terrorists come and threaten, our
domestic terrorists. That's
yes.
what it was.
Yeah.
They called us domestic terrorists, and that we were threatening the life and safety of the previous CEO.
And fortunately, media were there covering it, so they said there was nothing, nothing violent and nothing threatening about this peaceful protest.
And so that really propelled us, and I think ultimately, the numbers, lived experiences, this community voice was the reason the campaign was successful, and that public pressure made it really hard for officials who were in charge of demolition to say no to, because now people were watching and now people were really invested, and it wasn't as easy as, oh, we're going to demolish and that's just that. It was, no, these are people's lives, these are people's livelihoods and families that you can't just uproot and displace via demolition.
And every single time we showed up to comment in numbers, they would retaliate against us. They would put something out in the press. They would do something.
They attacked the Esperanza.
Yes, they attacked the Esperanza.
Through a news.
An open letter to the newspaper twice.
It seemed to us as though demolition was the easy way for the housing authority and some other government entities to take, and so it was upon them that this messaging had come out saying there's no point in repairing what's broken, so far broken. The whole group organizing around this had received a letter from the chair of the Board of Commissioners from the San Antonio Housing Authority, essentially saying, call off your attacks, there's no point in doing this, you're fighting for something that's already gone, just let the demolition happen, you're preventing residents from living their best lives.
But it did trigger the change, because that open letter to the press that the commissioner sent alongside with David was not just once but twice. She did it to 2 different news sources, and they both hit back hard, and that was a complete and utter embarrassment to Saha. And I think that is one of the biggest triggers that stopped the demolition, because they realized they can't lie to the public anymore.
This is something we had been giving public comment for multiple weeks now. Again, it was public housing tenants, it was neighborhood leaders, it was community activists, it was Westsiders. And this time, for whatever reason, press stuck around and interviewed us. And the next day that the articles came out, we saw the TV segments, and it was all in the community narrative. It was driven by what we had been saying this whole time. And it was right around January where we heard official confirmation that the ex-CEO David was leaving and we had a new CEO coming in. I think for a lot of people, that position switch was huge, because the demolition argument had been fought so primarily from his office and from him specifically that once that got out of our way, it seemed very feasible that demolition could be off the table and we could save these public housing units. It might have been because of that we got this wind under us, and thus the media kind of switched and decided to stop with the narrative from the housing authority and start with the community lived experience narrative. But around that time, I think we all kind of realized, you know, we can win this, like we can stop this demolition. The moment we knew Alazan was going to be saved from demolition was about the 3rd week of January in 2021.
That day, that was like an awesome day. We had just had, with Esperanza, a plática about don't demolish the Alazan. It was for Dream Week, and it was an amazing conversation. I remember that Ed Hinosa, who was the current CEO, actually attended the plática, and he was making notes and putting things in the comments. So that kind of told me that he was going to be a little different. But a week later, the announcement came that they were not going to demolish. And as he sat on the Housing Commission, the words that came out of his mouth are utter shock to all of us. Housing is a human right. That was...
Yeah, our job.
I want to cry. Like, that was the greatest day ever.
Yeah.
And it was quick. It was... very to the point. It said, we have decided to roll back our plans on the demolition of the Alazan Apache courts, and we will be exploring further options for how to move forward. I remember being on the phone with some of our community leaders, Kayla Miranda and Letty Sanchez, who had been fighting this for almost a year at this point, and just like pure happiness from this announcement.
Every comment that we had made over the past, couple of years all went into their presentation to the public. All of our comments were on that presentation. Everything that we were saying was on that presentation. And it was just so validating, because we had been called liars and troublemakers and criminals and everything else by Saha for so long. And just the fact that somebody came in and said, you know what? We were wrong. Y'all were right. Let's fix this.
And so to us, I think that was a big signal of our voices are heard, our voices are getting into the mainstream, so much so that the CEO of the Housing Authority is using it, and it's in the claim of the demolition not going to happen.
Now, change is not something that's going to happen overnight. It never does. And when you spent decades under the leadership of a tyrant, it's like trauma that is induced to you. So it's going to take time, and it's not something that's going to change so quickly but it is changing.
Something that Graciela Sanchez, a West Side leader, always says is, you know, you keep throwing marbles in their path until they trip and fall, and that's how you know you've won. And the marbles are small things, you know. Anybody can show up to public comment, anyone can use their 3 minutes, but repeatedly you do it, and eventually you get the media on your side. Eventually the narrative around it becomes your narrative, becomes your lived experience.